Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to AfroCommunications. As usual, we have come back once again to talk about the failures of United Nations in Africa. The failures of United Nations in Africa, particularly South Sudan and Rwandan genocide. The failures of United Nations in Africa, particularly the conflict in South Sudan and the genocide in Rwanda. So you can call it the failures, the double failures of United Nations in South Sudan and Rwandan genocide. Double failures of United Nations in South Sudan and Rwandan genocide. AfroCommunications, we always say the truth, you disseminate the message, and you answer the question. Today I'm going to talk about the double failures of United Nations in South Sudan and Rwandan genocide. This organization was created in 1948 following immediately the end of the Second World War. United Nations is a multinational organization that responsible just to unite most of the countries are under United Nations. Its world mandate is to maintain peace and cooperation among all nations, as well as development. For example, the Millennium Development Goals, fighting HIV, poverty, conflict, and others. If United Nations was created to maintain peace, to what extent that United Nations reached its goal of maintaining peace in Africa and other countries, particularly in South Sudan and Rwandan genocide? And if not that, when did the United Nations manage to maintain to prevent conflict in Congo 1960s after independence? When did this organization manage to prevent the assassination of Patrice Lumumba? Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in the presence of United Nations. United Nations was there monitoring what was happening in Congo. United Nations had surrounded Lumumba's house in what they call protection of Lumumba. Lumumba get out of his house to escape against Kasavubu and Moise Sombe military, who wanted to kill him and the Belgian. Lumumba escaped, but the United Nations soldiers prevented his escape, and they put him under house control. Mobutu's government and others, they captured Lumumba under the presence of United Nations. Nothing was done. This is the greatest tragedy mistake of United Nations and a failure in Africa. It is a proof that United Nations is nothing contributing to maintain peace and stability on the continent, otherwise protecting the interests of its founders. Now it's 50 years. The death of Lumumba is still on the heart of Africans. The second tragedy happened in Rwanda, 1994, when Rwandese took pang and machetes to start killing one another under the supervision of United Nations, watching everything happening. Nothing was done. Romeo Berea, a Canadian general by then and the command of United Peacekeeping Forces in Rwanda, he took mobile phones to start calling direct to New York, Washington, calling Kofi Annan, calling the Secretary General, calling President Bill Clinton about what was happening in Rwanda. Need protection. Nothing was given to him. Nothing was given to him. Nothing. United States did not send its military command. We see sending it to Afghanistan. We see sending it to Libya. We see sending it to Syria. But they left. Million people died, Tutsi, massacred, in the presence of the world watching, with what they call United Nations World Peacekeeping Body. South Sudan today, 10,000 people died recently, within a few months, in the presence of United Nations. Ban Kim, the Secretary General of United Nations, he sent a message that peace is important. But he did nothing to save these people because they are useless. This is the World Peacekeeping Forces, peacekeeping body, responsible for negotiation, facilitation, peace building, peacekeeping. But peacekeeping when people are dying every day. They are just going there to supervise in their Mercedes, limousine, Land Cruiser VX expensive cars to see how many people have been killed. And then after they go in the media that there is a conflict. This is their role. This is what they contributed in South Sudan today. This is what they did in Rwanda, supervising what is happening and then call. Democratic Republic of Congo today, how many people have been killed, lost their lives? The largest peacekeeping forces, which is owned by Canada, are part of United Nations. Where is Africa going? South Sudan lost approximately over 10,000 people just within a month. Started in December conflict. This organization was created under what was known United Nations was created to replace the League of Nations. The League of Nations, after the end of the Second World War, United Nations took over. And the United Nations right now, we still ask the legitimacy, the contribution and the role of this organization in African context. in preventing conflict in Africa. It has a lot of money, lot of arms and ammunition, planes, professionals, facilitators, expertise. But these people, they could not manage to use their mental faculties to save the lives of South Sudan, 10,000. They could not manage to forecast the misunderstanding which at the ordinary ground, the first ground between President Salva Kiir and his vice president. What had happened? They failed to realize the mistakes of Salva Kiir at the beginning, that it might cause conflict in South Sudan. But they were quick to understand that President Assad of Syria has the weapons of mass destruction. They were quick to detect Saddam Hussein's power as a dictator against the Kurdish people. They were quick, United Nations, to realize that Gaddafi was against a small clique of people, a small group of people in Benghazi. And they were quick to realize that Gaddafi was violating R2P responsibility to protect Article 72 of the United Nations that call upon the rights to intervene in case if the country fails to prevent, if a leader fails to restore peace or to create peace, protect his own people. They could not realize that Salva Kiir's attempt to change the vice president and all the ministers, he was putting a country on tension that may escalate into conflict. United Nations, they did not manage to observe these problems. Right now, they are out of the conflict. They left Uganda as United States superpower of Africa. This is the problem that Africa is still suffering in, and other countries who are known as members of United Nations. AfroCommunications. We are looking at the situation which is happening always in Africa and other countries as part of members of United Nations, and the failures of this organization to maintain peace and stability in South Sudan and Rwanda. The situation in South Sudan started in December. It was between President Salva Kiir and his government members whom he had accused for a coup d'etat and whom he had already just expelled out of the government. The population saw this as unfair, violation of the constitution of South Sudan, and they call upon the unification of all political opponents to fight against the President Salva Kiir. What followed after the expulsion of Riek Machar was the mobilization. He went into the war. The conflict started because these people had been provoked by the government, and they had nothing to do apart from declaration of the conflict. All this process, United Nations was watching. In fact, they took most of these refugees into United Nations protected ground in Juba. The United States was watching, and the entire international community was watching. What is happening in the world today? We should not forget what happened in Rwanda. The United Nations, everything happened, but nothing was managed to be done. This is why we need to go back on the concept of power and struggle. People often fight for power, struggle for power. But the result or the end always into conflicts. And we know that the United Nations, its mandate is to prevent these conflicts. They can go to Afghanistan, they can go to Iraq, they can go to all Middle Eastern countries fighting for the freedom of the people, fighting for the rights of the people. But in South Sudan, it wasn't the case. Even right now, people still killing one another, but it's not the case. Let us see. Let us look at United Nations with the democracy today. In the free market economy, there is always democracy came with the concept of free market economy. But the free market economy of democracy has left the ruling classes. The rich become more richer, and the poor becomes more poor. This is a state of violence. Can't we say that even at some point, democracy is root cause of conflict? And how should we prepare the United Nations to prevent these violences which happen or which resulted into the inequalities which is already set up by democracy, and the United Nations, an organization based on democratic principles, could not manage to prevent these chaoses when the revolution happened. We know our people died 1 million in the presence of United Nations in Rwanda, the genocide. Free market decided that some will stay rich. This is the free market and the democracy. Some will stay rich, others will stay very poor. Citizens now are just consumers of the politics. The masters getting more rich, the poor getting poor. Lack of rights, lack of democracy, lack of protection, but the organization is in New York They always drink as I'm drinking. They receive phone calls all the time. What is happening in the world? What is happening in Rwanda? What is happening just in South Sudan? After communication, they shut off their phone. United Nations in Rwanda, 1994. General Romeo Derea from Canada, who wrote the book, said, "Let devil shake hands." Shaking hands with the devil. He believed that United Nations knew what was happening in Rwanda, but they avoided it. United Nations knew what is happening, just what's going to happen in South Sudan, but they left it. They neglected these problems. People, they are dying every day, but they always false prophet. They prophesize things which they don't do. Our people have died because they had great trust into United Nations that they're gonna be rescued, but they were just watching what is happening in the country. This is the organization which repressed the League of Nations. Kim Jong, the Secretary General of United Nations, he knew that he has been several times talking to the government of Juba. President Barack Obama insisted the release of prisoners rather than preventing the escalation of conflict that sparked off the death of these people at the beginning. This is the world body which has already Article 73 protection of people, which declared the refugee convention, but nothing they have implemented to prevent the death of South Sudanese. The double failures of United Nations. United Nations failed to prevent the dictators in Africa, particularly right now in South Sudan and even in Rwanda. They have failed to analyze the conflict, the pre-conflict. They have failed to analyze the attitude of political rivals, to assess the situation and to prepare for the outcomes of these wrangles, political wrangles. And they have failed to intervene, to provide an urgent or immediate intervention before the conflict escalation of conflict, something that has sparked off the death of Africans year by year. Look, in Democratic Republic of Congo, M23, Rwandan, General Ntaganda, how many people have they killed in the presence of the world peacekeeping forces? We need to think. We need a strong cooperation that should promise the stability on the continent, rather than living on the false promise of an organization that always disappoints the people at the end. It happened that in 1960s, United Nations disappointed Patrice Lumumba and was assassinated in a brutal death in the presence of United Nations. It was in Congo. Muammar Gaddafi was caught live. United Nations nothing did to rescue him. What should we do to prevent this situation? Should we create another organization, or we should stay in this defective organization, or does the organization looks for self-interest? Should we create another form of African Union that its mandate is to prevent this conflict on the continent, or should we just live under what we have today? What does the world thinking about the conflict and the death of our people, those who died for nothing? Those who died for nothing. People who died for nothing in South Sudan, the failures is a double failure for United Nations. Let us see politics. Let us have a look at politics. Politics. In politics, see, we're going to look principle number 1, because I told you that this is my Bible, my Quran. This is my Quran, 500 ways of changing the world. 500 ways to change the world. So this is my medicine. It is my political clinic where I got and give the world the medicine. Medicine number 1 for United Nations: transfer power to teens for political experiment. In the world of apathy, in which apathy and this disillusion do, it is a future of generation that we should turn. A direct and radical way to do so would be to hold a week-long experiment in which politicians were repressed by their youth equivalent. We should create, think about transferring power, facilitate the transfer of power by United Nations, or prevention of peace. I mean prevention of conflict before before escalations into maybe a massive civil war. This is medicine number 1. Medicine number 2: proposed bills for public purposes. Prospective, for example, laws, constitution, bill of rights characters should be publicly posted for the discussion. The United Nations should emphasize on the use of, in the belief of the respect of the constitution of the country. That's medicine number 1. United Nations should monitor the state institutions, the political parties, and the Bill of Rights of the country to make sure that people are free to exercise their decision with the government in power. But the failure of this, it is the result of what we see today in South Sudan. Pay politicians in proportion to voters and votes. I'm not paying politicians, paying international actors. They should be paid to prevent corruption and biases always happen into negotiation. The use of drive-through giving people the right to discuss about the nature and the affairs of their country. Plus many other ideas will help to prevent these problems that is happening today. Thanks. And God be with you. Let's change the actions of United Nations to maintain peace. Thanks.